Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the IISS. My name is Zainab Olyabek. I'm an assistant research analyst for the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you for joining us today for this month's conflict briefing, where we will be focusing on assessing Yemen's stalemate and fragmentation. Speaking on the topic today, we have Dhia Muhsin, assistant research analyst for the Middle East and North Africa, and Emile Hokayem, senior fellow for Middle East security. Now, Dhia, if we can start with you, can you tell us where the conflict stands today and how we got to this stage?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Zainab, for that very nice introduction. So, Yemen, as you all currently know, is in a very dire state. It is a very high-intensity conflict. The propensity with which we see airstrikes on a daily basis is very high, and hostilities have maintained as they have been over the last few years. But over the last 6 months, there have been a number of very notable developments, the first of which is obviously the Stockholm Agreement, and secondly, in my opinion, the redeployment of the United Arab Emirates' armed forces, or Presidential Guard rather. So, a few introductory points. In June alone, there have been over 120,000 new IDPs across the country, and that's almost half of the number of the people who have been displaced in Yemen thus far this year. And hostilities between Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, and the Saudi-led coalition persists, with increased deployment of drones against the Saudi-led coalition and missiles and rocket attacks. But also we are seeing a further deployment of these systems into Saudi and coalition territory. In Taiz and Dali, we again see persistent fighting, and this is a common theme throughout Yemen. And Mark Lowcock at the United Nations Security Council last week said that there are over 30 active front lines at the moment in Yemen. So what I'll start off by doing is showing a map of the zones of control in Yemen at the moment. And what you see in front of you right now is essentially a relatively up-to-date, if not as up-to-date as possible, map showing who is where and who is responsible for what. So in red we see Ansar Allah, and in green we see the pro-Hadi forces / the Saudi Arabian coalition. But again, the key point over the last 6 months has been the UAE's redeployment of forces and what that looks like on the ground. So of the information that we do know, we are aware that UAE forces began withdrawing earlier this month, at the end of last month, and it was namely from the UAE namely withdrew military vehicles and equipment from the area of Ma'rib, which is just east of Sana'a. And there have been sources that pointed out that withdrawal of UAE troops from that front line resulted in a handover of operations from themselves to a number of coalition-backed forces. So, the anti-Houthi effort at the moment is in a state of metamorphosis. We are seeing changes, and namely along the Red Coastal Front, we've seen a withdrawal of UAE forces. Now, it's important to understand that the UAE's redeployment isn't necessarily the UAE withdrawing itself from the conflict, but rather reorienting who is where and who is doing what. So if you look to the south of the map, in Aden, we know that there is a continued UAE presence there. We also know that there has been a handover of forces along the west coast of Yemen, or along the Red Sea coast, from UAE forces to coalition-backed forces, and a number of those include Tariq Saleh's forces and the Tehama Resistance and the Giants Brigade, of whom a number of these groups are dispersed around the area that the Houthis have been currently occupying. But onto the question of Hodeidah, fighting has persisted, and despite the Stockholm Agreement, there has been an increase in hostilities, and we have seen the hostilities sustain. But for the Houthis, who are engaged in this diplomatic track, the important point, at least for me, is the little stretch just before the northwestern corner of Yemen and right beneath Hodeidah. And for the Houthis, that section is almost critical to retain. Now, excuse me, local militias have expelled Houthi forces from large sections of Ta'iz, but we still see ongoing hostilities in Ta'iz. And I've noted a number of the battlefronts of the 30 that were mentioned by Mark Lowcock. And what we have seen is that despite this diplomatic track being taken on one side, the hostilities persist elsewhere, and the fact that you have such a strong focus on diplomatic agreement in one area has, understandably increased hostilities in other regions. So I think for that part, I'll hand over to Zainab.
You're done with your section?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dhia. Emile, could you give us a more detailed description of the regional outlook of the conflict?
Sure. Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. The dynamics in Yemen are going to amplify or highlight the key dilemma that everyone working on Yemen is struggling with, but at times choosing to ignore, which is how to develop and deploy leverage with the Houthis. And bear with me for a second. This is a vexing question because no one really has an answer to it, and because understandably, the UAE and Saudi Arabia being the more powerful actors and being Western allies, there's a lot more emphasis on how to develop leverage with these two actors on the Yemeni battlefield. But with the UAE redeployment, I think the issue of how to deal with the Houthis is going to become a lot more prominent. So here's how I see it. Everyone understands how to develop and deploy leverage, for instance, on Saudi Arabia or the UAE. They face military exhaustion. They face high political costs, high reputational costs over Yemen, over the Khashoggi affair, and so on. So it is essentially a question of political will. And we've seen over the past few years that at times that leads to a reduction of hostilities, that leads Western countries, including the Quad here in London and elsewhere, to basically obtain concessions from these two in terms of the Stockholm Agreement, in the past the Kuwait track, and so on. We also have a sense of how to deploy leverage over President Hadi Mansour, the president who's the internationally recognized president, who's however a very weak individual, and that is essentially through Saudi and to a lesser extent the UAE, which has a difficult relationship with him. And again, we saw that in Stockholm and elsewhere, where Hadi Mansour himself is quite resistant, but ultimately he depends on his regional patrons for political relevance, and so you're able to extract some concessions from him, even though they're imperfect and short-lived and so on. We also have a sense of how to get leverage over anti-Houthi forces. Again, it's through the regional patrons. Dhia just mentioned Tariq Saleh or Tihama or Giants Brigade and so on. Their military behavior has been to a large extent shaped and constrained by the preferences and the political calculations of the UAE. Now with the UAE drawdown, that changes that picture. Now, if you're the UN, you're also seeking leverage, but in a place that's very difficult to navigate. I mean, if you're Martin Griffiths, what are the sources of leverage? the possibility of renegotiating UN Resolution 2216 at one point, but you need the Security Council to be on board. You need the Saudis and the Emiratis to, acquiesce to that and so on. But, that's in the future. Related sanctions or a recalibration of sanctions in Yemen, that's also an idea that's out there. A recalibration of the blockade, but you need something in return. So if you're the UN, the one time you really had leverage in the past year is essentially when the UAE decided to mount its attack on Hodeidah. Now, of course, the UAE ambition was maximalist. They wanted to take over Hodeidah, engage in a massive battle, and so on. But the threat of that helped Martin Griffiths and the UN team to negotiate the Stockholm Agreement, which in my opinion, and people can disagree with that obviously, but in my opinion, wouldn't have been possible if you didn't have the threat of force. So that brings us to the fundamental dilemma when it comes to the Houthis. Is the only leverage military at this point, given the nature, the steadfastness, the resilience, and the outlook of this force. So if you look at it, when it comes to the Houthis, so as I said, the UAE answer to how do you build leverage is to, we want to besiege Hodeidah and so on. That kind of work, and we'll discuss a bit later, how well Stockholm is implemented or not. For the Saudi theory of leverage, however, is a lot fuzzier. The answer that we get, at least publicly, is that we're going to defeat the Houthis and that will give us leverage, or we're going to totally cut them off and so on. Well, 5 years into that war, it's not clear that this is doable. And of course, if you look back at the record of Saudi statements, early on it was that all Houthi missiles had been destroyed. Well, it wasn't the case. That if they wanted to see Sana'a, it would only take a month. Well, that was a few years ago, and Sana'a is, still in the hands of the Houthis and quite say. So the Houthis, the Saudis, I don't think have a theory of leverage yet, and the strategy, I would argue, is essentially driven by mere frustration. I mean, the escalation is much more a sign of Saudi frustration than straightforward malice. And then there's another actor that is quite prominent on discussions in Yemen, which is Iran. First, Iranian leverage of the Houthis is quite elusive, I would argue. I doubt that Iran has some kind of decisive leverage over Ansar Allah. But two important points. The first one, Iran doesn't really need leverage. I mean, it's not a situation in which it needs to assert command and control over forces on the ground, where it needs a direct intervention and so on, because its goal is not absolute victory. Its goal is to bog down and drive up the cost to its regional rivals, Saudi and the UAE. So you don't necessarily need the leverage. Some of the capabilities that you offer the Houthis are quite useful in this regard. The other important point about Iran is that despite the fact that it doesn't necessarily need this massive leverage on the Houthis, it wants others to believe that it has some leverage, because this is how you stay in the game. You need the Europeans, you need others to believe that if you're nice enough to Iran, or you build another regional security track and whatever, something may come out. And I would argue that in this case, Iranian influence, whether positive or negative, plays at the margin, except when it comes to, as we saw, drone attacks or long range, the kind of things that riled up the Saudi leadership. So when we think about the UAE redeployment, which I think is going to be at the heart of any discussion in Yemen, and it's going to shape the political and military dynamics there, keep in mind the following. The first one is that Saudi replacing UAE troops here and there, fine, but Saudi's record of management of local actors is pretty bad compared to the UAE one, and the Saudis have a hard time pointing to a successful stabilization effort in Yemen. I mean, there's a story of Ma'arib, but that's not necessarily a Saudi stabilization effort. The Emiratis have a better record in this sense. The second point is that the Saudi military underperformance means that it can continue to hurt the Houthis or Yemen, or the Yemen, the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen, but it hasn't been able to calibrate military leverage for political aims. And I think this is going to be even more pronounced in the coming phase. Another important point is that we may well see competition among UAE-backed forces who now have to reposition themselves towards Saudi, which is going to be a bigger military player on the ground. And that in and of itself can lead to instability in nominally Hadi controlled areas. And we already saw that. In the days after the UAE drawdown redeployment became clear, Tariq Saleh, the nephew of Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president who allied with the Houthis at the end of his life, before being killed by them, made a claim for leadership over other militias, including the Giants Brigade and Tihama and whatever. His force is smaller but more cohesive and more capable, but the others push back on him, right? And I think there's a risk here that you will have greater tensions between those groups. Another source of friction that is likely to increase is the competition between Hadi and the STC, the Southern movement. That is also something else that the UAE used to mediate. It was more on the STC side than on the Hadi side, but it had to cater to Saudi preferences, which tend to be more on the Hadi side than the. So, while we may applaud the UAE redeployment because it may lead to lower level of intensity in lower levels of violence and intensity in terms of the fighting. In the medium term, I think, in the short and the medium term, there's also a potential for more violence and lesser leverage. I mean, the way I like to say it is that I wish Saudi had taken the step that the UAE took, and I wish the UAE had remained where it was in that thing. I know how controversial that may be, but the question is, how can you build towards a political agreement? And I don't think the Saudi position today is necessarily going to lead there, whereas the Emiratis are much more aligned on that. And finally, I mean, just to put things in broader terms, the Saudi UAE position on Yemen is not something that is totally impossible for the international community to work with. I'm not talking about their military behavior and certainly the massive pain inflicted on Yemen. But my point is that politically, here is where they stand. First, they're not attached to the fate of Hadi at all costs, right? So the fate of the president is not a non sequitur for them. It's not like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, where you don't discuss the fate. That's, early in the political process, the UAE, but also Saudi Arabia, would consider saying, okay, let's review the parameters of 2216. The second point is that the UAE and Saudi only have one track in Yemen at this point, and that's the UN political process. It's in part because their own weakness in terms of on the ground in Yemen, that they cannot themselves design and impose the kind of process they want. But the other one is also because they also depend on the legitimacy of 2216 and others to operate. And it would be massively problematic for them if they were to operate circumventing the UN. The third point is that the UAE and Saudi, increasingly Saudi, are fine with a level of decentralization or even federalism in Yemen as part of a final solution. And in a way, I suspect that this is going to be in the any future stable Yemen will need some level of decentralization, not necessarily full-fledged federalism. I mean, I'm not myself a Yemen specialist, so I don't know exactly how that would work out. But from the perspective of the regional actors, they're on board. Compare this to Syria, where Russia, Iran, Turkey are all opposed to federalism in Syria, right, for their own reason. And finally on this is that despite the very confrontational, adversarial, harsh Saudi and Emirati rhetoric on the Houthis at time, they still accept that the Houthis need to be included in and have to play a central part in the political settlement, right? They didn't oppose, in fact, they encouraged negotiations in Stockholm between Hadi and the Houthis. Same thing in Kuwait, same thing elsewhere. So it's not a situation where, yes, I know the rhetoric can be very brutal at times, but politically, I think the position is a bit more realistic. From the Houthi perspective, or anyone else in Yemen, you need Saudi and the UAE, but especially Saudi, to offer political legitimacy to a political settlement there. I mean, look at the border, which is the country that really, on which Yemen is the most dependent on this one. And the second point, which is also on the minds of many people, is Yemen will need Saudi and UAE reconstruction money. Given the fact that they played a massive role in the destruction of the infrastructure and much more in Yemen, I think the international community will expect them and will demand them as part of political settlement to commit to it. Sorry, I spoke a lot, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how this was playing out, and Dhia is the one who can tell you a lot more about what's happening inside Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Emile. To put all that into context, I think we need to address the Houthis' military posture in Yemen.
Sure.
Dhia, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So across the last 6 months, we've managed to see much of what Emile has said manifest itself across a number of the battlefronts in Yemen. And while I touched on a number of those previously, there were two that I really wanted to focus on. The first of which is Drayam, which is just 20 kilometers from from Hodeidah, and that is one place where we've seen a siege by the coalition imposed by way of the coalition's previous advances north towards Hodeidah, as Emile mentioned, and there are approximately 7,000 civilians in that in Ad-Durayhimi, and while this is important to consider, this also touches on the issue of how the Houthis respond to Saudi's military to the Saudi-led coalition's military posture. So the first thing that I wanted to note was the uptick in drone attacks against Saudi Arabia, and again we've produced a graphic that shows as many of the recorded incidents as possible since the start of the conflict. Now, over the last 6 months or so, we've seen an increase in the number of attacks that have taken place from Yemen going into Saudi Arabia. Now, why does this happen? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, there is a deterrent element to this. When Ansar Allah are able to use low-cost military systems to target, for example, civilian infrastructure like Abha Airport, or even the Aramco facility near Riyadh, and I understand that the issue of attribution for that one incident is questionable. What I'm trying to say here is that the ability for a non-state actor to target a facility as sensitive as these says to the coalition, look, we have the ability to strike your sensitive targets, back off a bit. And even with deployment of systems like the Burkan 2 missile, these again show how Ansar Allah as a non-state group can penetrate the air defense systems of a very technologically enabled coalition and inflict damage against them. And they have in the past targeted air defense systems and made that very clear to the coalition that if you increase airstrikes, we have our own air capability that can return that in kind. And that being said, the fact that as you mentioned, there is a reorientation of alliances, and UAE's withdrawal has meant that, you know, the anti-Houthi effort is in many ways fractured as well. And you know, the title of this event is Yemen's stalemate and fragmentation, but also the anti-Houthi coalition is fragmenting itself also, and we've seen this manifest in how groups like the coalition forces, and I'm talking about the Yemeni ones, haven't been able to agree on things. So when the UAE announced its decision, Tariq Saleh said, okay, all of you are going to be led under me, but you know, the Giants Brigade and so on all said, no, we're not going to. So how these actors calibrate their response to the Houthis is one thing, but the Houthis' ability to leverage punishment against the coalition is another, and that will solicit a different response. But I think it's also important to put this in context within the Stockholm Agreement, and you know, we've seen that the Stockholm Agreement, which was reached at the end of last year, outlines three principles. So an agreement on the city of Hodeidah and a mutual redeployment of forces across the three ports in Hodeidah, Salif, and Ras Isa Marine Terminal. As of May this year, the United Nations confirmed that, you know, there was a redeployment of forces on the Houthi side away from these ports. Secondly, an executive mechanism on activating the prisoner exchange agreement. Now, I haven't personally seen anything that has suggested that there has been advances on a prisoner exchange agreement between any of the sides. And then at the end, a statement of understanding on ties. Now, what this suggests is that this diplomatic process doesn't necessarily have the political motivation to really be the first major step in a peace process, because the language here is one quite ambiguous, and when you break down the understanding on ties, none of the actual articles in that understanding have been worked towards, and that's evidenced by the fact that we've seen increased fighting in the area. What we've also done is broken down the Hodeidah Agreement, and the Hodeidah Agreement is essentially identifying what is to happen in Hodeidah, and the first thing is, has there been an immediate ceasefire? And there hasn't been. So since December, what we've noticed is that forces along the area of Kilo 7 and Kilo 16 have been clashing, both on Ansar Allah's side and on the coalition side. And while there has been while the United Nations has said that there is a mutual redeployment of forces, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually taken place. If anything, local sources have suggested that, you know, Houthis are able to take Coastal Guard uniforms, put them on, and suddenly change the affiliation that they have. Whether or not these are coastal forces is something that you only know if you're actually in Hodeidah, but again, it's something that is unclear whether it's actually taken place, hence the reason why I am not personally convinced that a mutual redeployment of forces has taken place. Now, the second phase of the redeployment of forces means that the forces are to withdraw 18 kilometers away from the city, and what we've seen is 5 kilometers, a 5 kilometer withdrawal on the part of Ansar Allah, and 1 kilometer on the part of the Saudi-led coalition. And reports have suggested that there hasn't been any removal of military manifestations, that being, you know, the filling up of trenches, the removal of anti-air capabilities. But what we have seen is, you know, action on the UN side and the establishment of the Redeployment Coordination Committee and Security Council updates. But again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Stockholm Agreement has maintained, and I think if you focus too much on one area, you are leaving the rest of Yemen to experience violence, and that again says, you know, are we focusing too much on Yemen and not enough? Too much on Hodeidah and not focusing enough on the rest of the country? And again, by the uptick in violence in other areas like Dhia, like Ma'rib, that is quite the case. Again, what we've tried to do is map what the Stockholm Agreement essentially tried to do. And this is essentially a map that shows the state of play in December when it was first reached. And what we can see here is a number of World Food Programme facilities, UN facilities, and the positioning of Ansar Allah and the Saudi-led coalition. Saudi-led coalition is in green. The Ansar Allah are in red. But again, what this tells us is that the humanitarian situation is very much dependent on how willing the coalition is to the coalition and the Houthis are to provide access to the UN, to these facilities. Again, in the address that Mark Lowcock delivered last week, he said that bureaucratic measures imposed by the coalition in terms of the distribution of aid has been incredibly has slowed down the process of humanitarian aid distribution. Again, the same can be said on the Houthi side, who only in May allowed the United Nations access to a food storage facility in Hudaydah that had over 51,000 tons of wheat. Now, there are multiple reports saying that a lot of these facilities have rotting goods, they've expired, and that essentially all of this aid cannot be used. And you would think that the Stockholm Agreement was to remedy this, but what we see here is that when you shift the battlefield, when you shift the deployment lines, you have some facilities that are even more vulnerable to fighting. Now, what I've essentially tried to do is show that the forces have moved 5 kilometers. The Houthis have moved 5 kilometers eastwards, and the coalition has moved 1 kilometer eastwards as well. But again, even though that the United Nations are deployed around the port, and even though that the United Nations confirmed the Ras Isa marine terminal and Salif port are in UN custody, that doesn't mean that we've seen any improvements, because a lot of the revenue that is provided through these ports has not been distributed to the necessary entities through the Yemeni central bank. And I think with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Dhia. I'll now invite questions from the floor. There will be a mic going around, so please wait for that, and please state your name and affiliation prior to asking your question. Yes, please.
I'm Frederick Cheetah, Project Associates. I was just wondering, given that the UAE has obviously played such an essential role in this conflict, that calling it the Saudi-led coalition is perhaps a bit of a misnomer, because it seems to me that both strategically and tactically they seem to be the ones that have been really driving this conflict, both on the military side and the diplomatic side. Or would you agree, or would you disagree? I mean, would you say that actually Saudi Arabia is still the most important figure on that side of the conflict?
Thank you for your question. Personally, I still think that it is fair to say that it is the Saudi-led coalition, because if you look at the way in which the Houthis respond, I'll take it back to the drone attack. What this tells us is that a lot of the attacks that go into coalition territory have been into Saudi Arabia rather than into the United Arab Emirates. And I understand that there is a tactical reason for that. The UAE is farther away; it's harder to hit targets, but that still hasn't stopped them from trying to hit Abu Dhabi Airport or Dubai, and they're very aware of the economic costs of that. But what I think, as far as the battlefield dynamics are concerned, is it still is the UAE's. It still is Saudi Arabia's problem. So if you remove the UAE, and these forces essentially don't necessarily have the direction that they once had before, or political factions aren't able to cooperate in the way that they once were able to, it's incumbent upon the Saudis now to be responsible for whatever's taking place. So it really is now more than ever a Saudi-led coalition, as opposed to one that was shared between themselves and the UAE. The UAE certainly provided we'll say a structure to Yemeni strategy, but again, the Saudis are now responsible for Yemen, and I think Emile would agree in saying that it's up to them to see through the war now.
I would put it differently. There's a massive irony here. Saudi owns Yemen, but the UAE has shaped Yemen a lot more, right? And this is one of the fundamental contradictions that we're gonna face in the coming phase. The UAE, whether at the military or political level, has been a lot more involved on the ground, has been a lot more, has taken on the job of mentoring local forces. It has embedded its officers, in Yemeni, with Yemeni partners. It has injected a lot more money into local projects. In terms of stabilization, I think their thinking has been a lot more sophisticated, and so on. I mean, we can debate whether it made sense from at the beginning or whether the returns are worth it. But the point is that I think the UAE strategy was more forceful on that point. The problem is one of size and a problem of imbalance of interest. The future of Yemen is fundamental for Saudi Arabia because of this large border, because of 22, 24 million Yemenis who are in dire straits now, and if nothing is done with that, that's Saudi's problem for later. The reputational and political costs have been much greater for Saudi Arabia than they've been for the UAE. So like in total, I mean, I go back to what I said earlier. The UAE has shaped Yemen in part because of how they empowered a variety of forces across the country, but it's Saudi that owns the Yemen problem. Sorry to put it this way, I don't mean it in any derogatory way towards the Yemenis. And that's a fundamental contradiction. And that's why I made the comment in my earlier remarks that I wish it were the other way around, where Saudi, which has actually led the more destructive part of the military campaign, which is the air campaign, had actually unilaterally de-escalated, and the UAE had not engaged in a unilateral drawdown or redeployment at this point. I think that this creates, in a way, the wrong incentives for local actors. I think it's also going to have it may have an adverse impact in how Western capitals think about the Yemen issue.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, if we can.
Thank you very much. Rosalind Marsden from Chatham House. I'm a Sudan specialist, and I wanted to ask the panel about the role of Sudanese ground forces in the Yemen conflict. I think Sudan is now supplying between either 17,000 and up to possibly 30,000 forces, mainly from the Rapid Support Force militia, who've been causing a lot of havoc inside Sudan. And I wanted to ask whether the UAE redeployment, how that's likely to affect the need for Sudanese forces, whether it means that UAE will not be putting so much pressure on Sudan in future, or whether their redeployment will mean there's an even greater need for these Sudanese forces who are essentially mercenaries. And could you also just say how many ground forces are there altogether under the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen at the moment? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for your question. The Sudanese question is very fascinating in that over the last few months we've seen the Gulf states heavily interested in what's been going on in Sudan, and 3 billion, a pledge of 3 billion to the TMC, Transitional Military Council, was announced, and then 500 million was deposited directly into the Sudanese Central Bank. So the extent to which I think the UAE will be able to coordinate or influence RSF movement may depend quite highly on what Saudi Arabia wants out of it. So whether Saudi Arabia feels the need to have that extra manpower in the southern regions and in along the red coastal area, I think will depend on how Saudi Arabia wants to calibrate its response to UAE redeployment. As I mentioned earlier, we know that the UAE has redeployed itself around Aden and around the south predominantly. So if we see, and reports have suggested in the past that there have been local protests over the presence of Sudanese RSF forces in Yemen, namely over treatment of women and just more generally their presence there being seen as foreign occupiers. So again, as I mentioned before, I think it would largely depend on how Saudi Arabia would want to respond to the UAE's change in how it's positioning itself in Yemen. As for how many ground forces there are in the coalition, I think Emile might be better suited to answer that.
The 17,000 to 30,000 number strikes me as a bit too high. And we have had the tendency to just go for the upper estimates on all this. So I'm personally doubtful that it's those numbers. The second one, it has to do with the mission of those forces. And what's actually interesting when you look at like casualties levels and so on, I mean, they seem to have a much more static role in number of places rather than necessarily an offensive one. I mean, we saw them engage in some battles, but whether it's airport protection and fixed position, so I mean that's the interesting bit. I agree with Dhia that ultimately in this new phase, it primarily depends on what the Saudis want, and that they may want those forces, possibly more. But it's also possible that without a direct management role, actually it makes more sense to withdraw them. I mean, the reason why from an Emirati perspective it worked is because you had Emirati oversight and control of those forces and so on. I mean, are the Saudis really prepared to do it the same way? I mean, are they capable? That's a different matter. Ground forces in Yemen is extremely difficult thing to evaluate. I've covered mostly the Syrian war, and I remember that we were arguing over numbers from morning to evening, and that's because forces on the ground exaggerate how large they are because that means they get more salaries and because they look stronger and because that increases their political leverage and so on. It's also the case in some places. Don't also forget something fundamental in all that. When we talk about the Yemen conflict, we tend to reduce it to the international, i.e. Saudi UAE intervention in Yemen, without recognizing that it's fundamentally a civil war with a lot of local drivers, a lot of local forces that are involved in this power struggle. And a lot of those forces can be very active on some fronts in certain periods and just go home afterwards. And we've seen this because when you track the violence, peaks of violence, I mean, there are clear peaks of violence followed by, longer periods of calm and so on. So what are the standing for it? It's quite difficult to put a number on that. We have a sense of, how large the UA contingent is. We have a sense of how large a couple of those brigades that we're talking about, Giants or Saleh and so on. But it doesn't necessarily give us a sense of the military balance of power because it depends on so many other things. Ultimately, the Houthis have been strong, militarily strong and resilient, first because of their ethos. Second, because they've been able to capture, the arsenal of the Yemeni military, which made them the most powerful military force early on, to very detrimental effects sometimes, because they're the ones who started the big sieges in Ta'az and Aden and so on. But it's not necessarily because of their sheer numbers, right? Over time, they grew the force because they were able to attract, people who were outraged by what the Saudis were doing, people who needed a salary and so on. But this is not, it's not a standing force the way we would see it elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, I'm former law enforcement intelligence analyst on transnational organized crime. I did work on a tax project for the World Bank in Yemen 10 years ago, where I saw the complete paralysis of an organization like the World Bank in coping with the road to conflict. They just can't get it. They don't have people, frankly, like Rosalind Marsden. They badly need people like that. My question follows on from Rosalind Marsden's question. You made an interesting comment about there's doubts about the attribution for the attack on the Aramco site, which I think said was near Riyadh. Is that a suggestion that it may have actually been Iranian? Secondly, on the mercenary issue, is enough attention being paid to what these mercenaries, RSF and others, and from outside the region, are going to be doing once all this ends? What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? And who's going to be in charge of them? And who are they going to be working for? Thank you.
Do you have questions?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your question. So, on the issue of the pipeline attack, so there have been conflicting reports. Now, some have said that the report was actually launched from the south of Iraq, and in some respects, I can see how that would make sense. It's a slightly smaller distance for a drone to travel. It's easier to get across. It means that once you hit the pipeline, you have to once you essentially deploy the drone, you have less to think about when the distance is of a shorter distance. Now, there are two things to bear in mind. Again, the regional context. As everyone here is aware, the security landscape in the Persian Gulf is very tense at the moment, between the Iran and the United States. Would an Iraqi entity that launched that attack and managed to hit that pipeline benefit Iran as a signaling, as a means of signaling? Sure, yeah, but also bearing in mind that for these for the Houthis as well, there is a benefit, and it's, again, as I mentioned, them being able to say that we can hit these sensitive sites. And from my understanding, the pipeline that was hit wasn't hit directly. It hit a small section next to it. So I think it hit just a bit of ground, and that was it. It's mainly the fact that they can penetrate inside of Saudi Arabia and signal that, rather than actually hitting the pipeline. And again, these facilities are meant to be resilient against broader tensions in the region. On your question on mercenaries, I mean, I doubt that the RSF has a shortage of things to do. So, once the conflict hopefully subsides, I wouldn't not expect the RSF to go back to Sudan and continue operations there. But for other mercenary groups, again, I think it's highly dependent on what their patrons require of them. Hence the reason why they're mercenaries. I don't know if Emile has anything. Yeah, but I don't know if Emile has more to say about the Aramco. No.
If we have another question, perhaps? Yes, please.
Thanks, Gillian Loy from BP. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on the most eastern part of your map there, the vertical shaded section that's labelled Saudi, Emirati, Omani competition. I was just wondering if you could expand on the role of Oman in all of this at present and also going forward. Thanks.
I mean, this is an area of regional competition that is quite interesting to follow, to be honest, for a number of reasons. It's key to Omani security, and given what's happening in Gulf politics these days, if you're Oman, you see the emergence of the UAE-Saudi alliance. You're a bit worried about, what their intelligence and military forces may do along this area. It's also for Oman a question of internal stability. These regions have been largely spared from violence in the past few years. But Oman remains quite concerned that if things were to get worse in Mahra, Oman itself would be affected. The competition is proceeding in pretty complex ways. So there's competition about security and administrative appointments. We've seen lots of protests against the governors and other security officers in the region, and the Omani are trying to place their favorite candidates. Same thing with the Saudis and the Emiratis. And don't assume that the Saudis and the Emiratis are totally aligned there, right? It's not because they're part of the coalition that they necessarily have the same game in Mahra. We see this in terms of local projects, funding for local projects as well. There is money flowing there, and so on. I think the Omanis are primarily concerned with the emergence of organized militias there. Like, this is the one thing that they're the most worried about. And if the thinking, and that's, I mentioned earlier that federalism or decentralization may be in the future of Yemen. Perhaps, but if that's the case, then you may see a proliferation of local security forces across the region, which makes it a lot more complicated for a country like Oman and others. Will every neighbor of, there are two neighbors of Yemen, want to have their ally on site and so on. So it's a complex one. It hasn't turned out into an active conflict, and to be honest, the ingredients for it are there. I just don't think the willingness is there, including by local actors. I think there's also a lot of wise people around there who see what's happened to the rest of Yemen, so they're a bit reluctant to do that. It doesn't get as much attention in the media, I guess, like other places in Yemen. One of the things to note on Yemen is that, for instance, there's a massive attention to Hodeidah for understandable reasons because of the humanitarian crisis, the need to ship in supplies and so on. But per capita, for instance, the violence in Taiz is a lot higher, right? But that's not what's getting attention, in part because that's not where the Emiratis and the Saudis are bombing. There is the responsibility for the violence is on other actors, including the Houthis, but yet there's same thing with Mahra. It's increasingly important, but because there's no overt violence and airstrikes and so on, it gets understandably lesser attention.
Thank you. Do we have one final question there in the third row?
Hello, my name is Adil Hassan. I'm from the Southern Transitional Council UK office representative. There's a struggle between there's always a South question since struggle since the Civil War 1994. And the Southern Transitional Council is a key player in the war against the Houthis. But the peace process is quite slow. What does the panel think about the inclusivity of the peace process and how the Southerners can be represented and heard to avoid further conflicts and ensure a long-lasting peace process and peace and stability in the region and Yemen as a whole?
Sure, thank you very much for your question. So, as I mentioned before, I think it was short-sighted of Martin Griffiths to solely focus on Hodeidah in advance of the Stockholm Agreement, but I think if there was an alternative track to this, it would need to be one that is inclusive of all entities in Yemen. Now, and I think Emile and I have discussed this, the Saudis understand that, the Houthis have to be part of whatever peace process takes place. And I remember from our short meeting that that inclusive approach has to be applied throughout the entirety of Yemen in order to prevent pockets of violence springing up elsewhere. Now, the South's role is very important, and despite issues in representation among Southerners, it's saying we're not represented by the SDC. Others saying that we are represented by the SDC. I think that there needs to be a broader political consensus among all sections of Yemeni society and civil society in order to present a unified idea of what peace in Yemen should look like and who should be getting what out of it. So, in answer to your question, the South does have a very important role to play, and the SEC does have a very important role to play, particularly in the interest of representing its members. But I think broader discussion with other political entities is necessary, and that dialogue has to take place before a broader peace settlement can be approached.
The UN is struggling with the question of inclusiveness, not just in Yemen, in other places as well, right? I mean, it's at the heart of the dilemmas that any UN envoy faces. In Syria, the question is, do you bring in the Kurds or not? When and so. I mean, so let's get back to Yemen. The first point is that Griffiths or anyone else who comes after him will remain constrained by 2216 and how it designs the political track. So the question is whether you need to actually review the parameters of the resolution and then include others. But to revise the parameters of the resolution, you are going to need, Saudi and UAE cooperation, but you're going to especially need, the P5 to agree on that. And I think, it's not that they're opposed to it. It's just that they don't want to do away with a legal instrument without having a good sense of what comes next. The second issue is that the balance of power in the South, broadly designed, is not that clear. Yes, the STC is somehow popular. It's has support in a number of places, but it's also popular against the government that 2216 and others agree with. So the question is going to be, from your perspective, the kind of platform, as Dhia said, that you come up with. Is that something that can be negotiated with other non-STC entities before to build some consensus and then escalate, or the maximalist scenario is to say no, we want it all, we want independence, we want all these things. I'm not telling you that this is necessarily what your platform is. I'm just speculating about the political positioning. So you go all the way, you have maximalist goals, and then you de-escalate to find the sweet spot that you're happy with. The Kurds in Syria, interestingly, at one point played with the idea of not just autonomy, perhaps a state, and then they saw how it played out in Iraq. Then they realized that regional powers were opposed to it, and so on. So. And then how that the internal balance of power didn't work to their benefit, so they defined down what they wanted. In your case, what could play to the STC advantage is that if you're Saudi or the UAE, you say, you know what, federalism, or at least a level of decentralization is in the future of Yemen, right? So there is a kind of political opening, but that's not going to be a real one until you have movement on some of the bigger issue, 2216 and the balance of power vis-a-vis the Houthis.
Thank you. And I think it's time for us to draw this event to a close. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for giving their insight.
Thank you.